The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland. From the University of Maryland, this is Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff.
There was a time when Americans enjoyed a comfortable popularity in other countries, but recently that has changed. Today we discuss why Americans have lost credibility around the world with Andrew Kohut, president of the Pew Research Center and co-author of America Against the World. And now, Doug Besheroff.
Hi, I'm Doug Besheroff, and I am delighted to welcome our guest, Andrew Kohut, on behalf of the University of Maryland and Policy Watch. Welcome. Well, I am holding this microphone in my hand because we had a microphone malfunction. We're here first to talk about this wonderful book that you wrote with Bruce Stokes, America Against the World. Let me read the subtitle. How We Are Different and Why We Are Disliked. First, I know you've been asked this a number of times, but why the title?
Well, we've been the principal chroniclers of the rise of anti-Americanism in this new decade, and we wanted to write a book, have a more permanent analysis of the story, and we sat down to try to understand anti-Americanism, and I realized what we really hadn't approached was the role of the American public in the rise of anti-Americanism. Was there a role in the views of ordinary citizens that has led to a situation where the United States is very deeply unpopular in many countries around the world, in many countries where we've long had allies? And so we examined not only the image of the U.S., but the ways in which Americans were different from people in other countries, and the ways that has contributed and not contributed to the rise of anti-Americanism since the beginning of the new century.
Well, now that's interesting because I noticed in the book that you talked about a poll that was conducted by the Gallup organization, perhaps when you were there, in 1983. And here was the conclusion that you wrote. You said, Americans are seen as a good and productive people with an erratic or even dangerous government. Now, that was 1983, and I assume the erratic and even dangerous government was Ronald Reagan.
In the eyes of many Europeans at that time, that's right.
So now you're looking to see whether it's, we'll go back to the government and what our government did to encourage this, but now you decided to look at the role of the American people in this growing dislike of America. And you did this by polling? We
did this by reanalyzing the close to 100,000 interviews that we had conducted in 60 countries between 2002 and 2005, I believe, is where we cut off for this book. 60 countries and about 90,000 interviews. I'm equivocating on the numbers because we've added many interviews since. We're up to almost 130,000 interviews. Wow. This is an ongoing set of surveys. In any event, we reanalyzed American attitudes to see if there was a distinctly American way of thinking about things, whether the gap between Americans and people in other parts of the world, particularly in Europe and other advanced nations, was growing, and whether these gaps had contributed to the fact that America's popularity is a good deal lower than it once was.
Now, a good deal lower. I have some of these numbers here, so I won't test you. I'll read them, and then you tell me a little bit about this. This is, do you have a favorable opinion of the United States? Canada in 1990 goes from about 71% down to 59%. Germany from 78% to 41%. This is only 41% of Germans have a favorable opinion of the United States by 2005. Only 43% of the French. These are pretty striking declines over a period of 10 or 15 years.
Yeah, in the first survey that we did in 2002, We compared it to polls that the State Department had conducted at the end of the century in 1999 and 2000, and we found in 23 of 29 countries the favorable ratings for the U.S. had declined. And we said that there was the U.S. image was slipping all around the world, but there was still a reserve of goodwill toward the United States. We went back into the field in May of 2003, just after the end of the hostilities in Iraq, the initial hostilities in Iraq, and our headline changed to the image of the United States had plummeted all around the world. That reserve of goodwill that we had seen in many countries had disappeared. It disappeared especially in Muslim countries, but also, as you note, in places like France and Germany and even close by in Canada.
Now, I know the thrust of the book is about how we Americans contribute to that, but let's spend a moment, if it's all right with you, with the government. George Bush is often criticized for his rhetorical flair or lack thereof, and sometimes he sounds like a cowboy even to American ears, let alone to European ears. Is that right?
Well, to European ears, Bush sounds very American in a negative sense, and that was the case from the get-go. Even before the war on terrorism, even before the invasion of Iraq, he got off to the wrong foot among Europeans in the surveys that we had done in August of 2001. They think his values were typically American, and he didn't get Europe was what we came away from in our initial round of surveys.
In reading your book, one of the ironies to me was that Bill Clinton was viewed favorably by many Europeans and people around the world. One of the raps against George Bush is he was against the Kyoto treaties, and yet Bill Clinton was, I think, as negative on the substance of Kyoto, not on the rhetoric. How much of this is just rhetoric?
Well, rhetoric, I think, contributed a lot to it. I don't think, I remember we did some polls back in '98 about Kyoto, and if we had ever gotten into a real debate about it in this country, there would have been a lot of trouble getting the American public to go along with it because there was a sense of it was unfair. But I think what Europeans were reacting to in 2001 was the way in which the United States withdrew from the accords and the deliberations about them, as much as the American point of view on them.
So would a little bit of sugar make the medicine go down, to paraphrase a...
Well, I suppose so. Now, the Europeans, in all fairness, President Bush, were critical of us in the middle of the 1990s, saying that we weren't acting quickly enough to deal with Bosnia. Then they became somewhat critical of us when we did act, saying we were overreacting. So, we've always had sometimes a tough time with our European allies and with European public opinion. But what we've seen since 2002 is something quite different, a sense that the United States doesn't care about other countries when it sets its foreign policy, that its power is unchecked and it's used for its own purposes, and it's not a good multilateral player. And these attitudes are held much more deeply than criticisms of the United States were back in the Reagan years. I mean, your quote from my 1983 Gallup survey, we did a lot of looking at opinion during the Reagan getting tough with the Soviets and the European backlash, and it was quite different. First of all, it didn't affect attitudes toward the American people, and secondly, the depths of discontent with America were not really that great. They were about Reagan's get tough with the Republicans. They weren't broadly about America's place in the world, America's power.
And so, when the subtitle of your book is How We Are Different and Why We Are Disliked, that's because people are looking at us Americans and saying they don't like what they see.
Well, I don't want to overstate that. Americans are less popular as people are less popular in Europe, and certainly very unpopular in the Muslim world. But the blame is really more with the American government. And what we're looking at in the book is the ways in which American attitudes may have contributed to the policies that people around the world don't like. And I think that we make a case that there are some ways in which our exceptionalism, our difference from Europeans in particular, have made that contribution.
And that's what you talk about, which is the deeper causes of this dislike, and you call it, I think, as others have as well, American exceptionalism, this sense that we're different. One of the phrases you use is the city on a hill syndrome. And you quote Alexis de Tocqueville to say Americans have a, quote, rather silly pride in how good they are.
We are nationalists. If you look in our surveys about how we feel about the American way of doing things, Americans take much more pride, or much more inclined to say, we really do it better than other countries.
Well, it's true, isn't it?
Well, you ask most Americans, they'll say it's true. And much more so than in people in other advanced nations. Actually, we're quite a bit like people in other parts of the world. We're quite a bit like South Asians. We have the same views about our culture and our superiority as you see in the way Indians feel about India versus the rest of the world.
And the Chinese.
And the Chinese.
And the Japanese.
And the Japanese. But compared to other Western nations, we're quite a bit, we're taken with the way we do things. But the American point of view is not to take that city on the hill, that set of values that distinguishes us, and impose it on other people. And that's where we write about how our exceptionalism in some regards is misunderstood. There's not from the point of view of the American public, there's no desire to jam democracy or the American way of thinking or the American way of living down the throats of people in other parts of the world. The default position of the average American is not to want to rule the world or not to want to convert the world to our ideology. The default position is to ignore the world. And that's really where the public makes its contribution to the problems that many countries have with the United States.
Yeah, but I want to parse your sentence a little bit. You said, our view of what we're doing. The objective reality is we have 135,000 troops in Iraq right now. We had 500,000 in Vietnam. We still have bases that span the globe. An outsider looking in might say, well, perhaps the American people think they're not an imperialist or colonial power, but the objective facts on the ground are a little different.
Well, I'm not saying that the American public doesn't support the use of military force or taking a hard position to defend its interests, but it doesn't have an ideological point of view about imposing Americana on the rest of the world. That's the point I'm making.
I had some graduate students visit me about 4 years ago, graduate students from Western Europe, PhD students, and we were talking about American attitudes about religion and also about marriage and family. Marriage has basically disappeared from large parts of Western Europe as well. And I came away from that with a distinct impression they thought we were quaint.
Well, American values are different. Social values and religious values are quite different than what we find in Europe. You know, one of the interesting ways in which that plays out positively is we find that Muslim Americans are much more comfortable the Muslim minority in America is much more comfortable in a religious America than the Muslim minorities are in Western Europe, in secular France or secular Britain.
You speculate that, or you quote people who speculate that one of the reasons why religion is stronger here is that we don't have an established church, so religion has had an opportunity to shift with people's attitudes. Is that right? Have I got that right?
I think that's, I don't claim to be a historian of religion, but I think that's a pretty fair analysis of why it is. Religion is very vibrant. It's always evolving here. We have a center that studies called the Pew Forum on Religion that studies the intersection between religion and public life, and we're doing a lot of studies about the way the Catholic Church is being changed by the Hispanic immigration. And so this is not like the official the official religions of France or Italy or the Church of England, and that gives it a vibrancy and perhaps a closeness to ordinary people that doesn't exist in Europe. And I'm sure there are many other reasons that smarter people will come up with as to why America is religious and Europe is not. But the important thing is that our religion, to a certain extent, is held against us with respect to our policies. I cannot tell you how many people from Europe would come over and sit in my office and say, Andy, how did you people get so religious, and do you realize how it's driving American policies? And what I tried to do, Bruce and I tried to do in the book, is show that public attitudes toward going into Iraq or foreign aid or any one of a number of foreign policy issues has very little to do with religion. The more religious people and less religious people don't differ on policy issues in ways that are related to their religiosity. The exception is with respect to Israel. The white evangelical Protestants, the Christian conservatives, do express greater support for Israel on a religious basis. But that's one policy out of a range of foreign policies where we see very little effect. People don't tell us their religion doesn't matter. And when we look at the correlations between religion and behavior, they're not there.
That's religion.
Okay.
I was struck by your description of the differences between Americans and Europeans, for example, about the use of force and war. We're much more positive about the use of military force, aren't we?
We're much more accepting of force as an instrument of the way we relate to other countries. I mean, Americans are much more likely to say the use of force is legitimate than are Europeans. We're more likely to support preemptive war, even in the surveys that we've done, even in the era in which Iraq has become unpopular. There's still more support here for preemptive war than there is in Western Europe, for example, and not only in Western Europe, but in many other countries as well.
Why is that?
Well, I think we are Jacksonian in nature. When we feel threatened, we feel that we have a right to strike out and use our force to protect ourselves. We tend to be equivocal about the use of force. We're not extremely patient about the application of force. We've seen that. We're seeing that in Iraq. We saw that certainly in Vietnam. Attitudes can change. There were boxcar majorities that supported the war in Vietnam back in the 60s, at least initially. 74% in our polls supported the war in Iraq in March of 2003. And those numbers have come way down, as you know. Even the casual student of public opinion knows. So we are more inclined to use force, but we are quick to cut our losses when we don't feel the investment as being well made.
We've talked about what it is about us that leads those abroad to dislike us. Let's turn it a little bit. I know your book isn't so much about that, but look at what it is in them that makes them dislike us. And again, I was struck by a quotation in your book from Robert Cooper, who was an aide to the British Prime Minister Tony Blair. The rest of the world reacts to America alternatively because it fears America, it lives under American protection, envies, resents, plots against, and depends on America. Sounds like if we're the rich boy on the block, the most powerful boy on the block, people will naturally resent and dislike us.
Well, we have an empirical case of how that's not true. I mean, we have been the sole superpower since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And through the 90s, the American image ran pretty high. We had a war in the Gulf. In the United States, as we write in the book, when we took our first surveys, we compared them to polls taken all around the world by the State Department, and the image of the United States was favorable. What happened, however, was when America's policies were disliked and seen as not reflecting the opinions of people in other parts of the world, and not reflecting a multilateral approach, and weren't blessed by the UN, people became suspicious of American power. And the big boy on the block thing really became an issue. And the big boy on the block thing is what is the real issue right now, because we will have a change in administrations, and we may, have a dramatic change in policy. Dramatic change in policy is now going to have to convince people that we're trustworthy and that we're not going to use our power in such a way that other people have to worry about, hey, what are the Americans up to?
I was going to ask you about this later, but this is a good point. Let me read something from your book and ask you to expand on it just a little bit. Looking ahead, America's greatest strengths, its individualism and self-confidence, pose its greatest potential for problems of the world. These qualities have nourished America's extraordinary expectations almost to a national sense of entitlement. The risk going forward is that Americans will ignore the lessons of history, which teach that hubris and the inattentiveness to others that so often accompanies it can lead to trouble. So how does Hillary Clinton, a Barack Obama, or a Rudy Giuliani, or whoever undo what's happened in the last 5 or 10 years?
Well, I don't think you're going to undo those attitudes, because American individualism or optimism, our sense of we'll get around to it, we'll take care of it later, we can have it both ways, we're sort of hardwired that way. But I think what American political leaders have to do is make the case of our interdependence, the extent to which we need to have better relationships with other countries, and convince people that we really have to take actions on problems, not sometime in the long way out in the future, but pretty soon, because not everything can be fixed at the last minute by our technology. I mean, I think the best case of that right now is that many Americans are concerned about global warming. But a fair number of Americans are doubters, and many Americans also think global warming is a problem, but we'll get around to it at some point and may not be willing to make the sacrifices to the extent to which people in other countries are.
The phrase global warming brings up the last thing that we haven't really talked about, which is globalization, which in some respects is, in the eyes of many, another word for the Americanization of the world. And you picked that up in your surveys as well, didn't you?
Absolutely. The American pop culture, our exports, our movies, our television shows, our music are liked in many parts of the world, even in places where we are not popular. But in the surveys that we do, we find in every country of the world concern about Americanization. There's too much America, say, people in France or Latin America or even Africa, where we're still pretty well regarded.
I wonder, though, is that Americanization or is that just modernization? Is the modern world hurtling that way? And if it weren't America, it would be India or whatever would be the leading technological...
Well, that's the fact. I mean, globalization is not only the United States. Globalization is multinational companies all around the world. In fact, to a certain extent, probably America gets too much blame for the ways in which traditional ways of doing things, traditional ways of commerce are changing, because it's not just us. It's big companies all around the world and these rapid transfers of information.
It does seem to me that we're beginning to see some changes in attitudes in Western Europe. The recent elections seem to be moving those countries in a slightly different direction about economic modernization. Are you still polling? And are you picking that up?
We are polling, and the Europeans are very unhappy with their economies. There hasn't been a lot of growth. They want change. They want it both ways too. The French want change desperately, but they want economic growth desperately. But will they accept change? That's Sarkozy's challenge.
And of course, change comes with the English language, right?
Yes. 65% of the world, though, thinks it's important to learn to speak English, and the other 35% are French.
Well, on that note, it is time to turn to our audience here for questions. But while we're arranging to do that, let me say to our TV audience that if you have any questions or comments, feel free to write to Policy Watch at UMD, that's UMD for University of Maryland, .edu.
I wanted to ask you what's your sense of what we citizens say about the reactions of people in other countries to the American government and American policies?
Well, I think that Americans are concerned about the image of the United States. They worry about getting support from our allies. But one of the examples I use in the book comes from the 2004 election. On balance, people told us that they were concerned about these issues. But on balance, people re-elected President Bush, and the reason they re-elected him was because they preferred his leadership and the way he was dealing with the war on terrorism over the way that they thought that Kerry would potentially deal with such issues. So Americans have been two-minded about this. I think that a lot has happened since 2004, and the concerns are probably greater now than they were then, and they were pretty substantial then. But Americans tend to be pretty soft and equivocal multilateralists in their multilateralism.
Thank you very much.
Quite welcome.
This program was produced by the University of Maryland, which is solely responsible for its content. The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland.